Hi, everybody, and welcome back. So, at this point now, we've talked about kind of what is psychology and law broadly, how do we study issues in psychology and law, and we've discussed how, in the course of this class on alibis, we're going to really be kind of talking about how social scientists study a particular phenomenon using alibis as the hook. So, in order to do that, what we really need to do is start before we even get to alibis. And I know that this seems kind of silly. This is a class called Alibis and Corroborators. Why in the world are we talking about eyewitness identification? But it really is important to have this base knowledge of eyewitness identification before we move into alibis in order to fully understand the phenomenon in which we're going to be discussing and how social scientists started looking at alibis. So, we're going to start off with a little experiment here. I want you to study this face. Look at this face, and I'm going to ask you to pick this person out of a lineup. Now, this is already a really, really bad kind of setup for a study, right? This is not in any way a task like an eyewitness would do, right? You might not necessarily know you have to study the face, but I'm going to give you, a couple more seconds here to really look at this face and study it. And then when I click the next slide, you're going to see a lineup, and you have to pick who the person is. All right, here's your lineup. I'll give you a couple seconds here to study each face and to really come up with a solution here on who you think the guilty party is, in this case the perpetrator on the previous slide. Do you think you have it? Well, here's one of the problems. With our memory in general, with recognition memory, with this task that I've asked you to do. What do you do if the perpetrator isn't actually in the lineup I showed you, right? The perpetrator's in this lineup, but he's not in this one. What do? You end up selecting the person probably that looks the most like the perpetrator as opposed to the actual perpetrator. What should happen if you get shown this lineup and said, tell me who did it, is you should say it's none of them and completely reject the lineup. The problem is, for a lot of people, they think the only reason they're being shown a lineup is because the guilty party must be present. So this is slightly old data here, but eyewitness misidentification is the number one leading cause of wrongful convictions in America, right? You'll see here, if you look at these percentages, the total's over 100 because often cases have more than one cause of wrongful conviction. But in general here, when you look at this graph, you can see that overwhelmingly eyewitness misidentification is the number one cause of wrongful convictions in America. So because of that, that makes it very interesting to social scientists. What's going on here that there are 77% of the people who are in prison that are innocent had a bad eyewitness identification. Let's try and figure out why that's happening. So by understanding eyewitness identification, or really misidentification, we're really going to ask kind of two questions here. What can research tell us about factors that influence eyewitness memory? And then we're also going to ask, how can we apply this knowledge to mitigate or lessen the role of mistaken IDs in wrongful convictions? So we want to know what's going on to cause this. And then once we have that cause, what steps can we take to prevent that cause from continuing to happen? So in this scientific method for studying eyewitness memory, we can't predict with 100% certainty what an eyewitness can do, nor can we fully post-dict it or determine it after the fact. Instead, we can scientifically study it to make predictions about what is likely to happen, right? So in this case, it's what is more likely than not. What are some factors that probably will affect identifications or not? If we were to go back to that first study that we did at the beginning of this lecture with the perpetrator, and just by happenstance that perpetrator was your brother, and then I showed you the lineup, are you more likely to reject that lineup? Yeah, probably, right? Because you probably would look at those 6 people in the lineup and say, oh, my brother's not in that one, right? And so that's why we're not saying with 100% certainty what happens. We're kind of making probabilistic hypotheses about what's happening. So, putting on our research methods hat again a little bit, how can we study eyewitness memory? Well, we can create an event. And that event can be manipulated, right, with independent variables. It could be a very clear event. It could be a kind of fuzzy event. We could have the eyewitnesses be a little bit intoxicated, possibly. But we create an event where a crime happens. We then have the suspect view a lineup, right? And that lineup can also be affected in a lot of different ways, right? The type of lineup, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, how we can change the type of lineup, the behavior of the administrator, right? I kind of told you in the study at the beginning of this lecture, find the perpetrator in this lineup, right? That kind of suggests he's there, right? I could have said, find the perpetrator, and if you don't think he's there, feel comfortable rejecting the lineup, right? That's different behavior of the administrator that can have an effect on your willingness to accept or reject the lineup. There's the identification decision that happens, and then we can ask you your certainty of the identification, and we'll talk about factors that affect certainty also. So one thing that's really important to note about memory is, unlike how it's portrayed in movies and TV shows, and unlike how we see it possibly in books and stuff, memory is not a video system. You cannot stop, pause, and rewind your memory and very purposely relive a certain event. Every movie where anyone has amnesia, suddenly when their memory comes back to them, it's like all of a sudden they just remember everything as if it was a TV show that just played out in front of them. That's really not how memory works. There's a lot of things that affect memory. For example, your interpretation affects perception, right? If you are even politically leaning a certain way, liberal or conservative, and a politician from the opposing party says something, you are going to perceive that thing differently than if a member of your own party said that thing, right? The context affects perception. If you heard someone make a racist joke at work, that's different than if you hear someone make a racist joke at a comedy club where you know that this person makes jokes like that, right? And this is also true even visually, right? Certain contexts affect your perception, right? Like if you're walking through the mall, you might not notice if a serial killer walks by, right? But if you're looking in the woods for someone as a police officer, you might recognize that person better. Expectation affects perception, what we expect to see versus what we don't expect to see. We also don't remember all that we perceive. If you just think about it right now and look around the room you're sitting in, there's a lot of stimulus all around you right now. You hopefully are paying most attention to the computer screen, but there's all sorts of stimuli around you that you are not really actively perceiving because your focus is on something else. It would actually be very, very cognitively demanding for you to perceive everything around you. Extraneous information will affect what's recalled, right? There might be some extraneous information. Oh, I remember you at that party because you had that cute top on, or whatever the case may be, right? Memory, therefore, is more of a conclusion than it is an actual tangible thing to be retrieved, right? All of this in general, all of these things taken together affect what we choose to remember and what we choose not to remember. So in building a memory, there's 3 steps that kind of take place in order to build a memory, right? There's encoding, which is the acquisition of new information, right? We see something for the first time. You're hearing this lecture possibly for the first time, and you're starting to try and remember this new information and encode it into your brain for an eventual exam or just for your own knowledge. After encoding and processing it, we then have to store it. How well do we remember what we encode? We encode a lot more than we actually bother storing. If you think about it, just driving down the highway, you see a lot of stuff flying past you on the highway. If you pulled off after driving 10 miles down the road and someone said, tell me every single color car you passed. Well, we don't bother storing that information, right? We encode it. If someone were to ask you in real time, what color is that car? What color is that car? You would know it, but it's not important enough for us to actually store. So how well do we remember what we encode? And then finally, there's retrieval, or recalling what we've encoded and stored. So we've seen it, we've stored it, now we have to pull it back out and remember it, right? And if you think about this, have you ever been back in your hometown after going off to college or going back to your elementary school and seeing that teacher or seeing that classmate of yours and you're like, oh my gosh, I know you. What's your name? What's your name? That's a retrieval issue. You've processed the person. You've stored their face in your memory. You remember who they are. You just are having a hard time retrieving the name associated with that face. So we've already seen this kind of scientific study, scientific method for studying eyewitnesses already, right? And see that there's a lot of different things that are changeable. And so we're going to talk about some of these things that are changeable in the event as well as in the lineup. There are two basic kinds of variables that are present in eyewitness identification research, and these are called estimator variables and system variables. I'm going to go into detail on future slides about both of these, but the basic idea here is that estimator variables are those factors that are beyond the control of the criminal justice system and whose impact on the reliability of an eyewitness can only be estimated. We can only estimate how well the lighting was at an event. We can only estimate how clear your vision was of a suspect or of an offender at a certain event. Contrast that with systems variables. Systems variables are those factors that are under the control of the criminal justice system. So for example, if I showed you one photo at a time instead of a lineup of 6 people, I control that as the detective, right? If I were to ask you to take a closer look at number 3 in the lineup, I can control that. That's a system variable as opposed to something like an estimator variable. And some variables are a combination of the two. So what are some examples of estimator variables? Witness inattention, right? There are times, right, if I'm at dinner with my wife, who I think is beautiful, right, I might be so enraptured by looking into her eyes and listening to her conversation that I'm not paying attention to anything around me. And so if the police come in and go, who was sitting next to you at the table? I might say, I didn't see the table next to us. I have no idea. I was just focused on my wife. The age and gender of the witness also might affect things, right? Obviously, if someone is too young or if someone is too old, they might be bad witnesses, but they could be reliable. The gender of the witness also might matter because if you were to ask my wife at dinner, like, did you see anything about the person sitting next to you? She might point out their jewelry, their shoes, their watch, their earrings, right? The makeup they had on. I might be like, it was a girl and a boy. And that's all I noticed, right? Because I'm a dumb boy. And so the age and gender of the witness also can affect, or be estimated variables that affect what you perceive and what kind of eyewitness you are. The amount of stress you're under, right? Have you ever been walking down the street just like stressed out of your mind about something and you walk right past someone you know and they're like, hello? And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't even notice you there because you were so in your mind that you didn't even perceive the things that are going on around you. That's one type of stress. Another kind of stress is, let's say someone pulls a gun on you or pulls a knife on you, right? Pulls a weapon out. Well, you're probably going to be much more focused on the weapon and making sure you don't get stabbed or shot than you're going to be focused on, like, let me remember what color eyes that this person has, right? Because you're looking at the immediate danger in front of you. Viewing conditions are also something that we can only estimate. The lighting, the viewing time, the clarity of view, the distance, whether or not the offender had a disguise on or a hat or a hoodie or something on, could all affect your perception, and we can only estimate those within research. And some of those things are also very person dependent. I wear contacts or glasses. I wear corrective lenses of some sort in order to see anything past like 3 feet in front of me, right? My wife has 20/20 vision. So her clarity of view generally is better than mine, even when I have lenses on, because she has better vision. If for some reason my glasses are knocked off, all bets are off, and I'm like Daphne and Scooby-Doo, just feeling around on the ground for my glasses. So there are some other estimator variables that are a little bit more specific, right? One of these is the cross-race effect. Eyewitnesses are usually better at recognizing and identifying members of their own race or ethnic group than members of another race or ethnic group. This is not to say, and I cannot stress this enough, this is not to say everybody is just racist, right? But what it does say is if you are white, you will notice more subtle differences in white people than you will in black people, Asian people, Hispanic people. The same thing is true if you are Hispanic. You will notice more subtle differences in Hispanic people than you will in black, Asian, or white people. Why do we think that is? Generally, it's believed that we have this kind of same group, like we kind of group together, right? We tend to kind of move into certain areas and certain neighborhoods and run in similar circles with people that are like us generally. This is not to say this is a rule. This is just generally, evolutionarily what's happened, right? And that's why if you think about in major cities, there's kind of like a Chinatown in major cities, and there's a certain area that just might have Little Italy, right, where just Italian people are. And there's all these different groupings of people that are similar to each other. Well, if you're going to be around a bunch of people that all kind of sort of have similar features, you need to be able to differentiate between individuals somehow. And so if I'm a white person in a room full of white people, how will anyone know who I am unless they start paying attention to the subtleties about what make me different from the white person next to me, right? And so in general, right, we tend to pick things out on people that look like us differently than people that don't. And I'll tell you kind of a little story about this, right? I was on the cheerleading team in high school and in college, and my cheerleading partner was a female, and my first cheerleading partner ever was from the Philippines. She was Filipino. Whenever anyone would say to me on the cheerleading team, right, or not on the cheerleading, but outside of the cheerleading team, which one is your partner? I could very easily answer the Filipino one, because there was only one girl from the Philippines on the whole team. No one really had a problem with that, right? No one had a problem being like, oh God, which one's from the Philippines? I wonder which one's from the Philippines, right? Because 90% of the girls on the team were white, right? And so that was a very obvious, very easy thing that differentiated her from everybody else, right? If someone were to ask a buddy of mine who had a white partner, which girl on the team is yours, he'd either have to walk over and point her out, or he'd have to say, you know, the dirty blonde with the light eyes who's about 5'2", and he'd have to get into a lot more detail because it was hard to pick out which one was his partner in that group setting. That's basically kind of the cross-race effect, right? When we're around a bunch of people that look like us, we have to notice those subtleties. But when we're around people that don't look like us, we very quickly jump to the obvious thing of, oh, well, that's a black person or a Hispanic person or an Asian person or a white person or a redhead or whatever it is, just the most obvious feature of that person. Obviously, redheads are not a race, but moving on. So the forgetting curve, right? Most forgetting occurs right after learning, right? You lose approximately 50% of the information in the first 40 minutes, right? This is why, by the way, professors are always harping on you to please, please, please study your notes, read before class and after class, copy your notes again, because when this lecture ends, half of what I've taught you in this lecture, you're going to forget within an hour. And so in order to get you to remember most of this lecture, you're going to have to see it multiple times to remember more. The other thing that's interesting, though, is that the relationship between delay and forgetting is not linear. It is asymptotal down, right? It basically drops off precipitously and gets to zero and then kind of asymptotes right above zero. And so the longer the delay, you forget a lot, but the vast majority of forgetting is in that first day. And so this forgetting curve, people forget at different rates, but generally that's what's found, and we can only estimate the rate at which people forget. So another estimator variable is the effect of a co-witness. Most crime is witnessed by more than one person. And so eyewitnesses might share information throughout the investigation and identification process that actually affects their ability to be witnesses. And so, for example, if me and my best friend were at a football game and there was a great play that happened and I only saw the tail end of it, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's crazy. Can you believe the quarterback did that? My buddy might say, no, did you not see the beginning of the play? That was actually a lateral back to the running back. The running back is who made that throw. Now, all of a sudden, if someone asks me what happened in that play, am I going to say, well, I didn't see it, but I heard the running back made a really good throw? No, I'm probably going to say the quarterback lateraled the football back to the running back who threw the ball downfield. Wasn't that awesome? And my memory for that event is now changed because of what my buddy said next to me who was watching the game, right? This post-event information from a co-witness can and does influence an eyewitness's memory for the event, especially If the second witness, in this example I've used, me, believes my co-witness, my buddy, has a superior memory for the event. I know he saw the whole event. I didn't see the whole event. So I'm going to trust him, and I'm going to suddenly think that I saw the whole event the way he saw it. And this can be true in any number of issues, right? If you've ever seen a bar fight break out, you might turn your buddy and go, whoa, what happened? It's like, well, that girl threw her drink on that guy. Oh, that's crazy. Why in the world did that happen? And then someone else goes, well, no. That guy called her a name, so she threw the drink on him. He was being the bad guy, right? Not her. And then suddenly your memory for that event changes. And when the police come, you say with confidence, well, he called her a name, and then she threw her drink at him, and that caused a bar fight, even though you actually didn't witness what started the event. So there are some systems variables also, right? So those are all estimator variables. We can only estimate all of those examples we just talked about. Systems variables, as a reminder, are the things that are in control of the system, right? The system can choose how they're going to handle things. For example, the interviewing technique that's used. The police officers and the detectives choose to some extent the technique in which they use to ask somebody to look at a witness, right? Or to find an offender in a lineup. There's one example from I heard about from a police officer in Gainesville who was showing a lineup to an eyewitness who said, I don't care if we're here for 3 seconds, 3 minutes, 3 days, 3 hours, 3 months, or 3 years, we're going to get this guy. The suspect was in spot number 3 with a big 3 underneath his picture in the lineup. Is that coercive? Maybe, right? But that's something the system has control over. The identification procedure is also something that is under the control of the system, right? And there's a lot of lineup theory about this. So what is the purpose of a lineup? And this is where we'll kind of get into that lineup theory. The lineup is supposed to be a memory test, right? It's designed to give investigators more information than they had before the identification. When you look at this picture of 6 people, does anyone look familiar? Interestingly, recognition memory happens very, very quickly, right? And so you don't have to walk into a room and go, God, is that my mom, my dad, my grandma, my sister, my brother? I know they're all in the house. You walk right in the room and go, oh, that's my mom, right? You just recognize them immediately, right? It's not a reasoning task. You don't walk in and go, okay, well, she's cooking, so I know my dad and brother are out because they can't even boil water. So it has to be either my mom or my grandma, but the food doesn't smell quite as good, so it's not my grandma's cooking. It must be my mom cooking, right? You don't reason through and logic through how you recognize someone, right? You quite literally just remember. It's a recognition test. One of the mistakes that happens is police will look at someone who's studying a lineup for minutes and then go, okay, I'm pretty sure it's number 3, and think, good, they're being thorough. I'm so proud of them for really taking their time and really working through this. Well, that's not really what you should be doing. Someone should jump right off of that page at you and you say, there he is. That's the person. So this identification procedure also matters. And we'll talk about a lot of these things in detail in a little bit, but selecting fillers is also important, right? This idea of selecting fillers is you should, in a lineup, only have one suspect. Everyone else should be people that you know is innocent or are innocent, right? How do you know those people are innocent? They could be currently incarcerated. They were incarcerated at the time of the crime. If you're in prison, you can't be out on the street committing crime. They could be in the military and be stationed across the country, right, or across the world. You can't commit a crime if you're not in the country, right? Or they could, unfortunately, be dead, right? Dead people don't tend to continue to commit crime. And so if there's only one person in the lineup that could possibly be the person out of 6, and it's in position number 3, and I, as the witness, select number 1, I tell you, it's number 1, I know for a fact it's number 1, but we know for a fact that number 1's in prison, what does that tell you about my memory? It's probably not very good, right? And so because of that, you're going to say he's an unreliable witness, let's just move on from him, right? But those selection of fillers becomes very important, and it's within the control of the criminal justice system, because also, what if I, as a victim, said the person who assaulted me at the Barnes & Noble was an Asian man that was 6'1". And they bring me a lineup and there's 6 faces on it, and 5 of the 6 people on the lineup are white. And there's only 1 Asian person. What am I likely to do? I'm going to pick the Asian guy because I remember an Asian person assaulted me, right? But was it that Asian person? Or was it just, he just happened to be an Asian person they found to throw in the lineup, right? So there's a lot of detail that goes into this filler selection that becomes very, very, very important. And then obviously the instructions to the eyewitness explicitly telling them it's okay if you reject this lineup. The person might not be in here. We may have gotten it wrong as the police. That's fine. Do you see the person in here? That's in the control of the system too, and therefore it's a systems variable versus not giving that kind of instruction. In a meta-analysis on this kind of phenomenon, what we found is that in unbiased lineups, right, unbiased lineups have about the same level of accuracy as biased lineups in terms of actually getting the right person, right? So biased lineups work sometimes, right? We're not going to pretend like they don't work, right? However, what you see here on this other side, though, is that biased lineups have significantly higher, over 50% of biased lineups give you a false identification, right? That drops significantly in unbiased lineups. And so that's an important detail is people will say, well, we don't want to necessarily have a biased lineup because we might lose positive hits. We might, someone might actually see the offender. We might lose that if we make it an unbiased lineup. Well, yeah, but you know what else you're losing? A lot of innocent people going to jail. So with systems variables, the lineup presentation method is something that is important to eyewitness researchers, right? Simultaneous versus sequential presentation. Basically what that means is simultaneous is show 6 people at a time, right? That's a method of lineups. Versus sequential is 1 at a time. You only see 1 face at a time, and if you reject it, that's it. You never see that person again. Like that individual filler or possible offender in front of you. Simultaneous lineups, what we've found is that you end up making that more of a reasoning task of which of these 6 looks the most like the bad guy. If you only see 1 face at a time, you can't do that, right? You can only take your memory and match it up against the picture in front of you. So this lineup presentation method is important. Investigator bias is also present. Instead of having a police officer say, I don't care if we're here for 3 seconds, 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days, 3 months, 3 years, if the police officer doesn't know who the suspect is, that might be better so they can't influence you. They might, there's cases where police officers have said, why don't you take a closer look at number 1? Are you sure it's not number 1? Because the police officer knows it's number 1, right? Why does the police officer giving the lineup have to know who the guilty party is or the suspect is? They really don't. They can bring it into a detective and say, all right, the witness picked number 1. Is that right or is that wrong? Post-identification feedback is also a big issue. This could be verbal or nonverbal, right? Verbal could be something like, you just identified a dangerous criminal, good for you. Nonverbal could be smiles, nods, high fives, the general demeanor of the examiner, like, yeah, nice. All of that taken together inflates confidence and also changes the perception of the viewing conditions. So, quite literally saying, you just identified a dangerous criminal, if you were like a 4 out of 10 confident, when I tell you you did it, you got it right, your confidence jumps up to like an 8 or a 9 out of 10. And if I say, did you see it well? Before I say you got him, you might be like, I kind of had an okay view, but not a great view. When I say, good job, you got it, that shoots me up to that shoots your viewing perception. I saw everything. I know exactly what I saw, right? I'm confident. And that's a problem, right? So in some research looking at simultaneous versus sequential lineup presentation, you can see that in correct identifications, the simultaneous did have a little bit higher correct identifications than the sequential lineup. However, it also had significantly higher false identifications than the sequential lineup. So some people will look at this and say, yeah, but see, we're losing 8 identifications by switching to this new method. course, the response to that is, yeah, you are losing 8 good things, but you're also losing what? 20 some odd bad things. So in the totality, you're losing a whole lot more bad than the good is worth. And that's why researchers prefer a sequential lineup presentation versus a simultaneous lineup presentation. In a national eyewitness field study of the percentage of suspects in filler identifications of those who actually attempted an identification, you can see that in a sequential lineup, they identify the suspect actually at significantly higher rates than in a simultaneous lineup. And in identification of fillers, they identify fillers at a significantly lower rate in a sequential lineup versus a simultaneous lineup. So this again shows the diagnosticity of a sequential lineup is actually a better system. And for those of you who don't necessarily understand what I'm saying when I say diagnosticity, imagine we just went through a pandemic, right, with COVID, right? Imagine a COVID test. I said there's 2 COVID tests. One tells us that you're positive a lot and is fairly accurate when you're positive, but also tells us you're positive a lot when you're not positive. Or there's one that might be slightly less accurate on the positive end, but it never tells you you're positive when you're actually negative. Which test would you prefer? And that's a genuine question that people have to wrestle with. Some say, I just think we should tell everyone they're positive no matter what and make everyone quarantine. Some say, well, no, don't make me quarantine if I don't have to. And so this is this debate between law enforcement and criminologists and psychologists about this of what level of diagnosticity becomes more important. I don't want to be told I have cancer and start chemo if I don't really have cancer, right? I want a test to actually be able to differentiate the best possible way. Do I have cancer? Do I not have cancer? Do I have COVID? Do I not have COVID? Is this the suspect or is it a filler, right? I want that diagnosticity to be present. The percentage of not sure responses or lineup rejections also you can see is significantly higher, right, in a sequential lineup. Quite literally, about half of the people in a sequential lineup said, you know what, I'm just not really sure. A lot of them said, we're going to reject this lineup. I don't think they're there, right? In a simultaneous lineup, very few people said, not sure, right? And so that's another diagnostic measure. So taken together, all this together, we see that sequential lineups produced a lower rate of identifying known innocent fillers than simultaneous lineups. Sequential was as effective as simultaneous in identifying the suspect, and the rejection of the lineups were more common for the simultaneous lineup than for the sequential lineup. And so that's kind of taken together what this study showed about this systems variable, and that has actually helped bring about changes to eyewitness identification procedures. Another thing that happens quite a bit in eyewitness identification is there's this conflation of confidence and accuracy. A very confident eyewitness is actually very, very believable, right? Have you ever heard a friend of yours tell a story and you go, there's no way that's true? And they say, no, I was there. I saw it. And suddenly you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe that thing is true. They're so confident about it. Well, in general, actually, confidence is a pretty weak predictor of accuracy. It's not at all a predictor of accuracy when it's been changed through post-identification feedback, right? And so only under ideal conditions are confidence and accuracy modestly related for choosers when they pick somebody in a lineup. They're not related at all for non-choosers. The problem, though, is that jurors way overestimate this relationship. In court, if someone sits there in a court as a witness and says, I saw the defendant, and points their finger at the defendant and says, I saw him do it, that's very, very believable to a jury. And they go, well, who are we to tell him no, right? If he says he saw him do it, right? And that's just the end of it. And so this confidence-accuracy relationship becomes important because it's a pretty weak measure that we think means something that really doesn't. So taken together, what does all this mean? Well, first thing it means is eyewitness evidence should be treated as trace evidence, right? We wouldn't take a DNA swab and swab 3 different pools of blood and throw it all in the same swab, right? So why do we do that with eyewitness evidence? We don't mind letting witnesses talk to each other. Memory is a form of trace evidence, except for the fact that we can't collect a person's memory. And that's what's really, really hard, right? Also, we know for a fact the evidence is continuously changing and degrading. If we swab DNA, we can preserve that for a while. Hell, we can go back and test DNA samples from decades ago. We can't do that with someone's memory. After 2 days, like 80% of your memory is gone, right? And so we have to work quickly in order to collect that evidence that we can't really collect all that well without contaminating that evidence either. There's always going to be potential problems with original pieces of evidence, right? Because of estimator variables. You might be drunk at the bar, right? And we know alcohol affects memory. You might have a lousy view. You might have had some obstruction in the way to where you couldn't see it. However, we need to treat the evidence as carefully as possible to not contaminate it, because you can never go back and retest. If we get a bad blood swab and the blood splatter is still on the wall, we can go back and re-swab it. Once memory is contaminated, that's it. It's done. There's no way you can retest it like you can physical evidence, right? And that's why these systems variables and changing variables within the system become so important. Now, no current procedure eliminates all selection of innocent people. So even though we say it's more diagnostic, that doesn't mean it's fixed, it's better, it's all done, right? So there's no real good system that is perfect, right? But researchers have identified factors that are related to identification errors, and this information can be used to increase the reliability of eyewitness evidence, right? So we can do things to make it better, right? So even though it's not perfect, it's certainly better than it was. So can we mitigate the role of mistaken identification in wrongful convictions? Possibly, right? We have training seminars that educate people about factors that may lead to it. We've successfully helped change identification procedures to science-based practices. The APA does that very, very well. And also expert testimony and or jury instructions to educate jurors about factors that may lead to mistaken identifications are also important. In fact, my advisor, Dr. Laura Levitt, has served somewhat regularly as an expert witness on just this topic in court and has helped successfully argue to help people get out of prison that have been wrongfully convicted because of possible eyewitness misidentifications. So eyewitnesses tend to select the person who looks most like the perpetrator relative to other members of the lineup. And that is a quote that kind of sums this all up, right? Is we tend to pick people that look the most like our memory, even if it's not perfectly like our memory. So what in the world does all this have to do with alibis? Well, the first alibi study actually came from eyewitness researchers, because if you think about it, alibis are eyewitnesses. They're just eyewitnesses that you did not commit the crime in question because you were at another place at the same time, right? And so, for example, right now I'm sitting in my office. It's 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, sitting in my office recording this lecture, right? My wife knows I'm in my office. She's popped up here to see me. If someone said, hey, we think someone burnt your house down, I have an alibi. It wasn't me that burnt my house down because I have someone who knows where I was and it was at a different time, at a different place than where a crime happened, right? Therefore, right, if an alibi is just an eyewitness that you did not commit a crime, right, using all we know about eyewitnesses, can we begin to form a literature or a science of alibis? Right? It stands to reason if eyewitnesses are open to suggestion, if eyewitnesses have shaky memories, if eyewitnesses are subject to biases like cross-race biases and weapons focus, are alibis also open to these things? And that is a question that Olson and Wells asked in 2004 in the first scientific article really ever written on the topic. And that is what we will dive into in the next lecture. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them below or reach out to me via email, and I will try and get back to you soon. Thank you, guys.